The clock on the wall of the Redemption Creek jailhouse read 11:47, and Pauline Hart's fingers were moving so fast across the yellowed paper that Sheriff Raymond Hadley thought she might be performing some kind of dark sorcery right before his eyes. "You cannot possibly understand that," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, stripped of the authority he had spent 7 years building in this dusty corner of New Mexico territory. "I have had 3 deputies look at it. I sent a telegram to Santa Fe. Nobody can read it." Pauline did not look up. Her dark hair was pinned back from her face, and there was a smear of ink on her left thumb that she had not bothered to wipe away, and Raymond found himself staring at that small imperfection with an intensity that embarrassed him. "Then your deputies are not very clever," she said quietly, and her voice carried no malice, just plain truth delivered the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. And the man in Santa Fe apparently never studied polyalphabetic substitution. Raymond slammed his palm on the desk hard enough to rattle the tin coffee cup sitting beside the telegram. "Mrs. Hart, there are 12 men in the Nevada Silver Mining Company safe house right now. 12 men who will be dead before midnight if I do not figure out where Crane Holloway is taking that payroll." The cipher was his instructions to his inside man. "If you are playing games with me." She looked up then, and her gray eyes hit him like a cold river in January. Not angry, not afraid, just absolutely certain of herself in a way that Raymond, in all his years wearing a badge, had never managed to feel. "I am not playing games, Sheriff Hadley." She turned the paper toward him and pressed her finger to the first decoded line. "The payroll is not heading to Gallup, it is heading south. The Holloway gang is going to cross into Mexico through the Corazon Pass, and they plan to do it at midnight. You have 13 minutes. The room went absolutely silent except for the ticking of the clock. Raymond stared at the decoded message. Then he stared at the woman sitting in his jailhouse at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in the fall of 1883. A widow who had only arrived in Redemption Creek 6 weeks ago to settle her late husband's estate, and he felt the earth shift slightly under his boots. He grabbed his hat and his rifle. But before he crossed the threshold, he stopped and looked back at her, and something in his chest cracked open just a little, like ice breaking at the end of a long winter. "Stay here," he said. Pauline Hart picked up her pencil and went back to the notes she had been making in the margin of the cipher page. "Of course," she said, and the ghost of something that might have been a smile moved across her lips. He ran for his horse. 6 weeks earlier, Redemption Creek had been the kind of town that existed mostly as a rumor, a collection of adobe buildings and raw timber storefronts crouching in the shadow of the San Andres Mountains, with nothing to recommend it except a reliable water source, and a position along the southern freight route that made it impossible to avoid if you were moving goods between El Paso and Albuquerque. It was the kind of place where things happened only because geography demanded them, and where the people who stayed were generally the people who had nowhere left to run to. Raymond Hadley had come to Redemption Creek 4 years ago after a career in the Texas Rangers that had ended badly, not through any failure of courage or honor, but through the very specific kind of political maneuvering that punishes honest men in dishonest times. He had broken up a cattle theft ring that turned out to include the brother-in-law of the Ranger captain, and the choice had been presented to him simply and without room for negotiation: disappear or be disappeared. He had chosen the former, packed what mattered, and ridden west until the landscape got strange enough to feel like a new beginning. He was 34 years old, which in New Mexico territory in 1883 was old enough to have made most of his important mistakes and young enough to still be paying for them. He stood 6'2" in his boots, built along lines that suggested he had spent his life doing heavy labor with his whole body rather than just his hands, with shoulders broad enough that he had to angle himself sideways through some doorways, and dark hair going silver at the temples in a way that made him look more distinguished than he actually felt. He was not a man given to poetry or extended conversation. He said what needed saying and left the rest alone. He had been sheriff of Redemption Creek for 3 years, appointed by the county board after the previous sheriff had died of something the doctor diplomatically called a stomach ailment, but that everyone in town understood had been administered in his whiskey by a man he had owed money to. Raymond had cleaned up that particular mess quickly and decisively, and the county board had been so grateful that they had given him the job permanently and raised his salary twice, which meant he was now making the handsome sum of $65 a month and sleeping in a room behind the jailhouse that smelled of horse and old coffee. He was not, by any objective measure, living his best life. Pauline Hart arrived on the first Thursday in October on the eastbound stage from El Paso, and Raymond knew she was coming because he had received a letter 2 weeks prior from a lawyer in Texas named Beaumont Aldridge, informing him that the widow of the late Thomas Hart, formerly of Redemption Creek, would be arriving to attend to her deceased husband's affairs, specifically the matter of the land claim that Thomas Hart had filed 3 months before his death. A death which Mr. Aldridge described as sudden and Raymond knew to be the result of a horse accident on the Jornada del Muerto, where Thomas Hart had fallen from his saddle drunk at 2 in the afternoon and broken his neck. Raymond had met Thomas Hart twice. He had not been impressed either time. He was at the stage stop because he was the sheriff, and it was his job to meet incoming strangers, a policy he had established after 2 separate occasions where men with dark pasts had arrived in Redemption Creek and made problems before anyone knew they were there. He was standing with his arms crossed and his hat pulled down against the October wind when the stage door opened and Pauline Hart climbed out. She was not what he expected, though he would not have been able to say what he had expected. She was perhaps 28 years old, tall for a woman, dressed in practical traveling clothes that were dusty from the road but had clearly been expensive once, dark gray wool and good leather boots. She carried a single large traveling case and a leather satchel that she wore across her body as though it contained something irreplaceable. Her dark hair was pinned efficiently rather than fashionably. Her gray eyes moved across the square of Redemption Creek with the swift, cataloging intelligence of someone who has learned to assess environments quickly. She did not look like a grieving widow. She did not look distressed at all. She looked like someone who had arrived at a destination and was already calculating the fastest route to her objective. Raymond introduced himself and offered to carry her case to the hotel. She thanked him politely, declined the offer of the case, and asked 3 quick questions about the location of the land claims office, the name of the attorney who held Thomas Hart's papers in the county seat, and the schedule of the northbound stage to Albuquerque. He answered all 3, and she thanked him again and walked toward the hotel without looking back. He watched her go and felt that feeling again, the one he had not felt in a very long time, the particular unsettling sensation of encountering someone whose internal weather you cannot read, and finding that you want very much to understand the forecast. The trouble with Redemption Creek in the fall of 1883 was that Raymond Hadley's romantic complications were the least of anyone's problems, including his own. Crane Holloway had been operating in the southern New Mexico territory for going on 2 years, and in that time, he had graduated from stagecoach robbery to freight theft to what amounted to organized extortion of the mining operations that were pushing deeper into the mountains along the Rio Grande. He was clever in the specific way that dangerous men are clever, meaning he understood people's weaknesses and was entirely willing to exploit them. And he had assembled a gang of somewhere between 12 and 15 men, depending on the season and the job. Men who moved through the territory like shadows and disappeared back into Mexico before the law could coordinate a response. Raymond had been chasing hints of Holloway for 14 months. He had ridden 400 miles over that period following leads that went cold before he could close them. He had lost 1 deputy to a Holloway ambush on the road south of Doña Ana, a young man named Eddie Garcia who had been 22 years old and sending half his wages home to his mother in Mesilla. And the weight of that loss sat on Raymond's chest in the quiet hours of the night like something that would never entirely lift. The Nevada Silver Mining Company had been pushing a major payroll shipment through the territory for 2 weeks, moving it in stages to avoid exactly the kind of attention that Holloway specialized in providing. Raymond knew about the shipment because the company's regional supervisor, a tightly wound man named Marcus Pryor, had ridden into Redemption Creek and asked for Raymond's assistance in securing the final leg of the route. There was $70,000 involved, enough to fund a small war, and Marcus Pryor was not sleeping well. Raymond had agreed to help, had placed 2 of his 3 remaining deputies on the route, and had been operating on the assumption that the payroll would move north through the pass above Redemption Creek. What he did not know, what nobody knew except Crane Holloway and the man inside the mining company operation who was feeding Holloway information, was that the route had been changed at the last moment, and the new plan had been communicated via a coded message, delivered through a series of intermediaries whose final link was a man named Dolph Sears, a seemingly respectable freight agent who operated out of a small office on the main street of Redemption Creek, 4 doors down from the jailhouse. Raymond had picked up Dolph Sears that evening on an unrelated suspicion, a discrepancy in a wagon manifest that he had been meaning to investigate, and in the process of going through Sears's desk, he had found the cipher. It was written on a plain piece of paper folded into quarters, and it was clearly a substitution cipher of some kind, though the pattern was not immediately apparent. Raymond stared at it for 20 minutes. Then he brought in his deputy, a solid and reliable man named George Whitmore, who stared at it for another 15. George had ridden to fetch the schoolteacher, Mr. Abernathy, who was considered the most educated man in Redemption Creek, and Mr. Abernathy had stared at it and then driven them all into a state of heightened frustration by explaining at length the difference between simple substitution ciphers and more complex systems, while being entirely unable to crack the one in front of him. It was George Whitmore who, in a moment of inspired desperation, remembered that the widow Hart had mentioned in passing that she had worked in Washington before her marriage, something to do with the government, though he had not caught the details. He went to her hotel. It was 11:15 at night. Pauline came to the jailhouse without complaint, wrapped in a shawl over her sleeping clothes with her dark hair loose and her eyes completely alert. She sat down across the desk from Raymond, picked up the cipher, and looked at it for approximately 4 minutes while Raymond watched her and tried to remember the last time he had been so aware of another person's breathing. Then she said, very quietly, "This is a Wigner cipher. Give me something to write with." George Whitmore had found a pencil. Pauline Hart had gotten to work. Raymond had stood there watching her decode an encrypted message in the service of the United States Treasury Department, because that was what she had done in Washington before her marriage, and for the 3 years following it. A fact about Pauline Hart that was not on any piece of paper in Redemption Creek except in her own records, and she had not volunteered it because she had not been asked, and she was, fundamentally, a private person who had learned the particular discipline of keeping her own counsel in a world that tended to underestimate her at every turn. She had been recruited from the Ohio College of Liberal Arts, where she had studied mathematics and linguistics, and graduated first in her class in 1878 at the age of 22, an achievement that the college's president had described in her letter of recommendation as extraordinary and almost alarming. The Treasury Department's Office of Counterfeiting Investigation had been quietly hiring people who could work with numbers and patterns in ways that traditional law enforcement could not, and Pauline had been exactly what they were looking for, a mind that moved through symbol systems the way water moves through channels, finding the path of least resistance, mapping the hidden logic beneath apparent chaos. She had worked in that capacity for 3 years, and she had been very good at it, and she had been thinking about making it a permanent career when she met Thomas Hart. She did not particularly want to think about Thomas Hart. He had been charming in the beginning. He had been the kind of man who made rooms feel warmer and who told stories that made everyone lean forward to hear the ending. She had been 25 and had spent 3 years in a government office talking to almost nobody about anything except numbers and patterns. And when a man who laughed easily and looked at her like she was the most interesting person in any room showed interest in her, she had found it more difficult than she expected to maintain her usual clarity. They had married in the spring of 1881. She had resigned from the Treasury Department because Thomas found her work unsettling, which was how he put it, as though the existence of her abilities was something happening to him rather than something she possessed. She had moved with him to El Paso, and then, when his mining speculation took him farther west, to a series of increasingly uncomfortable situations that culminated in his brief, unhappy venture in Redemption Creek, where he had filed a land claim on a piece of territory he was convinced contained silver, and where he had spent more time at the saloon than at the claim, and where he had eventually died in the manner already described, leaving Pauline a small amount of debt, the land claim, and the slow, quiet realization that the loss she felt was not primarily grief, but something more complicated and harder to name. She was, at 27 years old, freer than she had been in 2 years, and the freedom tasted like something she was just beginning to learn to enjoy. Now she sat in a New Mexico Territory jailhouse decoding a message that was going to send an admittedly handsome sheriff riding hard into the dark, and she was thinking, with the particular clarity that came to her in moments of intense focus, that the cipher was not just an instruction document. It was also, if you knew how to read it, a map. Raymond rode hard. He pushed his horse, a big roan named Solomon who was accustomed to hard riding and who responded to urgency with the kind of controlled power that a good horse develops over years of trusting its rider, and he covered the 7 miles between Redemption Creek and the mouth of Corazon Pass in 11 minutes, arriving just as the sound of hooves and the distant glow of lanterns signaled that Crane Holloway's men were moving. What followed was not a clean operation. Raymond arrived slightly ahead of the gang but without the backup he needed. The deputies he had positioned on the north route were too far out to be reached in time, and he faced a moment of the kind of forced choice that law enforcement in the New Mexico Territory regularly demanded of its practitioners, which was the choice between waiting for help that would arrive too late or acting on the information he had with the resources immediately available, which in this case meant himself, his rifle, Solomon, and the considerable advantage of surprise. He used the surprise well. He knew the terrain, had ridden through Corazon Pass a dozen times, and he found the high point above the narrow entrance and used it to cut off the lead rider, firing a warning shot into the rock face 6 inches above the man's head, while shouting his identity and authority with enough volume to cause several horses to shy and break the gang's momentum. 2 men wheeled and ran immediately. Another 3, who turned out to be hired hands with limited loyalty to Holloway's enterprise, threw down their weapons when it became clear that they were being shot at from above by a marksman who could evidently put a bullet precisely where he intended to. Crane Holloway himself was not there. He sent men to do this kind of work and stayed back, which Raymond had suspected but confirmed when the inside man, whose name turned out to be Dolph Sears's brother-in-law, and who was riding with the gang in the belief that he would get a cut of the payroll, broke down quickly when faced with Raymond's questioning and revealed that Holloway was in a ranch house 12 miles east, waiting for word that the job was done. Raymond secured the remaining gang members with rope from his saddlebag, used the mining company's own telegraph line, which ran beside the pass road, to send a wire to the county sheriff in Las Cruces requesting assistance, and then rode 12 miles east in the cold October night to collect Crane Holloway, who was found by county deputies the following morning exactly where Sears's brother-in-law had said he would be, eating breakfast and reading a newspaper with the particular serenity of a man who has not yet learned that his operation has collapsed. The payroll was recovered intact. The 12 mining company workers who had been targeted in what turned out to be a secondary stage of the plan, a plan to take hostages in exchange for payment, were never threatened. Holloway and 4 of his men were taken to Las Cruces and held for federal prosecution. Raymond rode back to Redemption Creek in the cold early morning light, his body aching in the specific way that comes from hard riding and sustained tension, and he was thinking about Pauline Hart the entire way. He found her in the jailhouse when he arrived, still at his desk, though she had moved from the cipher to a notebook she had apparently retrieved from her satchel, and she was writing in it with the focused concentration of someone engaged in work they find genuinely interesting. She had made coffee at some point. The pot sat on the small iron stove in the corner, and the smell of it filled the room with warmth. She looked up when he came through the door. Her eyes moved over him in quick assessment, the way they did with everything, cataloging his condition, and he saw her register that he was whole and uninjured before anything else crossed her face. "The payroll," she said. "Secured," he said. "All of it." He pulled his hat off and set it on the hook by the door. "Holloway is in custody in Las Cruces as of this morning." She set down her pencil. "Good," she said, and something in the word was quietly satisfied, the tone of a person who has completed a task and found the result correct. Raymond crossed to the stove and poured himself a coffee that he did not particularly need, but that gave him something to do with his hands. He stood there for a moment, holding the tin cup, looking at the back of his own jailhouse, and then he turned around. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "where did you learn to do that?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those gray eyes that saw things clearly and said so. Then she told him. Not all of it, not the complicated parts about Thomas and the resignation and the specific shade of loss that had colored the last 2 years, but the broad facts of her work at the Treasury Department, the mathematics of cryptography, the way that pattern recognition worked, the particular logical structure of the Wigner cipher, and why it was both sophisticated and ultimately vulnerable to analysis if you understood the mathematical principles behind it. He listened without interrupting, which was more than most people managed, and when she finished he said, "You are telling me that you spent 3 years working for the federal government breaking codes." "Yes," she said, "and that you resigned from that position to move to El Paso." "Yes." He did not ask why, because the answer was written plainly enough in the way she said it, in the small compression of her mouth, and the thing in her eyes that was not quite sadness and not quite anger but lived in the space between them. He understood about choices made for reasons that later fail to hold their original weight. "The cipher," he said, "also mentioned something about a route." He had been thinking about this on the long ride back. The decoded message had contained more information than the immediate operational details. He had read it in the past in the light of his lantern, and there had been a second section that he had not fully processed in the urgency of the moment. Pauline opened her notebook. "Yes, there is a secondary location mentioned. Another cache, I think. The language is more abstract in that section, and I want to verify my reading before I tell you what I think it says. Because, if I am right, it is significantly more important than the payroll." Raymond sat down in the chair across the desk from her, the chair on the wrong side of the desk from where he usually sat, and looked at the notes she spread before him. The secondary location, as Pauline decoded it over the next 2 hours with Raymond sitting across from her, and the morning light coming through the jailhouse window in long horizontal bars, turned out to be the location of a second cache of documents, hidden on the Heartland claim outside of town. The Heartland claim. The piece of territory that Thomas Hart had registered 3 months before his death. The piece of territory that Pauline had come to Redemption Creek to settle. They stared at each other across the desk. Her husband, Raymond said carefully, was connected to Crane Holloway. Apparently, Pauline said. Her voice was level, but she set down her pencil and he watched her put her thoughts in order the way she organized everything precisely and without wasted motion. He mentioned once that he had investors who were interested in the mining territory. He did not name them. I assumed they were legitimate. I need to search that land, Raymond said. Of course, she said immediately. I will take you there. He looked at her for a moment. You do not have to. The land is in my name, she said. Whatever is on it is my legal responsibility. I will take you there. They rode out together after the morning was properly established. After Pauline had gone to her hotel to change into riding clothes, and Raymond had briefed George Whitmore on the night's events and arranged for the deputy to hold down the office. It was a cool October morning, the sky above the San Andres Mountains a clean, hard blue, the kind of sky that makes the distances in New Mexico look both vast and sharp-edged, and the land claim was 4 miles south of town, along a dry creek bed that wound through desert scrub and occasional juniper. Pauline Hart rode well. He had half expected otherwise, had harbored some assumption built of nothing in particular, and the reality of her in the saddle, easy and efficient and clearly comfortable, adjusted something in his thinking that he had not known needed adjusting. She had a gray mare that she had rented from the livery, and which she was clearly managing without difficulty, and she rode without holding herself stiffly or betraying any of the uncertainty that characterized people who are performing a skill they are not entirely confident in. You ride, he said, which was not exactly articulate but conveyed the observation. She glanced at him. I grew up in Ohio on a farm, she said. I have been riding since I was 6. Right, he said, and felt slightly foolish for his surprise, which she did not acknowledge. They found the cache exactly where the decoded cipher said it would be, buried under the foundation stone of the small prospecting shack that Thomas Hart had built on the claim in the spring of 1883, 3 months before his death. Raymond dug it up while Pauline stood in the doorway of the shack and looked at the landscape with an expression he was beginning to recognize as her working face, the look she had when she was processing information and had not yet arrived at a conclusion. The cache contained documents, as she had predicted. Financial records mostly, but also letters, correspondence between parties who had used pseudonyms that Pauline immediately began analyzing, and a ledger that appeared to catalog payments made to a significant number of people across the Southern Territory, judges and freight supervisors, and at least 2 officials whose names Raymond recognized from the county administration. It was, in short, the operational backbone of Crane Holloway's network. Not just the robbery operation, but the entire structure of corruption that had been enabling it, the system of bribes and compromised officials and hidden financial channels that had kept Holloway operational for 2 years, while law enforcement in 3 jurisdictions chased shadows. Thomas knew about this, Pauline said. She was not asking a question. She was sitting on the ground outside the shack with documents spread around her and the sun moving across them, and her voice was absolutely neutral. It looks that way, Raymond said. He was watching her carefully. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, he put the claim in his name so the documents would end up in a legal process if he died. Heir to the estate handles the land claim, heir finds the documents. She paused. He was protecting himself, not from Holloway, from the possibility that someone would come looking and he would need to leverage information about Holloway's network to survive the encounter. That is a sophisticated reading, Raymond said. It is the only reading that makes logical sense of the timing, she said. She looked up at him. He filed the claim 3 months before he died. He was already frightened. The fall sunlight moved across her face and he sat down in the scrub beside her, not because he planned to, but because his legs carried him there, and he looked at the documents and then at her and he said very quietly, I am sorry. She looked at him. For what specifically? For whatever he put you through, Raymond said, before, and whatever he has put you through now. Something moved in her eyes. Not tears, she was not a woman who cried easily or often, but something softer than her usual composure, a brief opening in the wall she kept around herself. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the documents. Let us make sure these are properly handled, she said. Then I expect I will have some feelings about it. They rode back to Redemption Creek with the documents secured in Raymond's saddlebag, and over the next 3 days, Raymond coordinated with federal authorities to whom the case was ultimately referred, given the scale of what the documents revealed. A marshal arrived from Albuquerque, a serious man named Caldwell who reviewed everything Pauline had decoded and the documents from the cache, and asked her 3 hours of careful questions about her methodology and credentials. And at the end of 3 hours, he told her that she had done better work than the 2 men his office employed for similar analysis. She thanked him and went back to her hotel, and Raymond, who had been present for the 3 hours of questioning, and had watched Pauline handle every single question with the precision of a person who is entirely confident in their work, felt something in his chest that he recognized with deep discomfort as being thoroughly and inconveniently in love. He sat with this recognition for 2 days. He was not accustomed to feelings that arrived with this kind of force or clarity. He was, in general, a man who processed his interior life slowly and without great drama, and the experience of having a feeling present itself fully formed and insistent was unfamiliar enough to make him slightly irritable, which George Whitmore noticed and mentioned only once before determining that the subject was not safe territory. On the 3rd day after the marshal's departure, Raymond walked to the hotel where Pauline was staying and asked her to dinner. She looked at him for a moment from the doorway of her room with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything that needed assessing, and he stood in the hotel corridor in his good shirt with his hat in his hands like a man who has run out of things to do with his composure, and he was aware that he had never in his 34 years felt so clearly observed. "Yes," she said. "The dining room downstairs at 7 o'clock. He was there at 6:50. Dinner at the Redemption Creek Hotel was not exactly a romantic proposition. The dining room featured a limited menu, considerable noise from the saloon next door, and lighting that could charitably be described as dim. But Pauline Hart and Raymond Hadley sat across from each other for 2 hours and talked in the way that 2 people talk when they have, unexpectedly, found someone who is keeping pace with them. And the food and the noise and the inadequate lighting became entirely irrelevant. She asked him about the Texas Rangers. He told her the truth about why he had left, which he had not told many people, the full version including the political maneuvering and the choice that had been presented to him, and his conviction that he had done the right thing despite the cost. She listened without offering reassurance he had not asked for, which he appreciated more than he could have easily articulated. He asked her about the Treasury Department work, what specifically she had done, and how cryptography worked as a practical discipline, and she talked about it with the unguarded energy of someone describing work they genuinely love, her hands moving as she explained the mathematical principles, her eyes lit with something that she did not bother to dim or modulate, and he watched her be fully herself in a way that he suspected she had not been permitted to be for a long time. And it felt like watching someone take their first deep breath after being underwater. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The work in Washington." She considered this honestly, in the way she considered everything. "I miss the work itself," she said. "I miss having a problem in front of me that required the specific things my mind does well. I did not miss Washington particularly. The social dimensions of that environment were not suited to me." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the men I worked with found my competence." She paused, selecting the word with care, challenging. "The social expectation was that I would be grateful for the opportunity and suitably modest about the results. I was grateful for the opportunity. I was not particularly modest about the results, because the results were good and I knew they were good, and pretending otherwise seemed both dishonest and inefficient." Raymond looked at her across the table and thought that he had never in his entire adult life found a woman's directness so specifically attractive. It was not just that she was honest. It was that she was honest with precision, with care, with a kind of radical clarity that cut through the elaborate social performances that made most human interaction feel like decoding its own kind of cipher. "You should not have to be modest about being good at your work," he said. She looked at him. "No," she agreed. I should not. They sat in the declining noise of the dining room as the evening got late, and he walked her back to the hotel stairs, and they stood at the bottom of the staircase with the lamplight making warm patterns on the wall, and she looked at him for a long moment and said, "Thank you for asking me to dinner, Sheriff Hadley." "Raymond," he said. A pause. "Thank you, Raymond." He watched her go up the stairs and stood there for a longer time than was strictly dignified before putting his hat on and walking back to the jailhouse through the cool October night. The land claim, as it turned out, was worth something after all. Not silver. The geology was never right for that, and Thomas Hart's conviction on that point had been based on hope rather than evidence. But water. The same dry creek bed that wound past the claim turned out, after some investigation by a man from the New Mexico Territorial Surveying Office who came through Redemption Creek in November, to run significantly higher in the spring fed by snowmelt from the San Andres, and the land it crossed was good agricultural land once it had access to water. The surveyor estimated it was worth considerably more than the debt Thomas Hart had left behind. Pauline settled the estate by mid-November. The land claim was sold to a family named Vasquez who were looking to expand their existing spread and who paid a fair price, enough to clear the debt and leave Pauline with a modest but not negligible sum. The legal business was done. There was no longer any practical reason for her to remain in Redemption Creek. Raymond was aware of this with the particular sharp awareness of a man who has let things develop at their natural pace and is now confronting the natural pace's potential consequences. They had seen each other almost every day through October and into November, sometimes with purpose, when he had questions about the Holloway case documentation, or she wanted to discuss the progress of the federal prosecution, and increasingly without purpose, the way that two people who want to spend time together manufacture excuses for it before they are ready to acknowledge what they are actually doing. They had ridden together twice on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted, out into the desert scrub where the San Andres made a backdrop, and the silence was the kind of deep, resonant silence that certain landscapes hold. And Pauline had told him more about her work in Washington, and about the Ohio farm, and about the mathematics of pattern recognition, and he had told her about the Rangers, and about his family in East Texas, and about the deputy he had lost in the Holloway ambush. Eddie Garcia, which was something he had not talked about with anyone since it happened. She listened to the Eddie Garcia story with complete attention and said, when he finished, "He trusted you to make good decisions about when it was safe to move. You made the best decision you could with what you knew. The fact that what you knew was incomplete is the fault of the intelligence failure, not your judgment." He had sat with that for a long time. It did not remove the weight entirely. Nothing was going to do that. But it shifted something in the architecture of how he was carrying it, and he was grateful to her in a way that went past words. By the second week of November, Pauline's remaining business in Redemption Creek was substantially concluded. She had booked passage on the northbound stage to Albuquerque, departing on a Friday morning. It was Monday. Raymond spent Monday being a sheriff in a functional and professional manner, and thinking about Pauline Hart with a fraction of his attention that kept insisting on expanding. He wrote 2 letters, tore both up. He had a conversation with George Whitmore that was ostensibly about the upcoming winter patrol schedule, and that ended with George saying, with the particular directness of a deputy who has been watching his sheriff be an idiot for 6 weeks, "Sir, if you are going to do something about Mrs. Hart, you might want to consider the timeline." Raymond said something noncommittal and went back to the paperwork on his desk and thought about the timeline with intense discomfort. On Tuesday evening he walked to the hotel again, and this time when she answered her door she was in the middle of packing and the room behind her had the specific organized chaos of imminent departure. He had planned to say something measured and careful. Instead what came out was, "Please do not get on that stage on Friday." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, through the window, The evening light over the San Andreas was doing something extraordinary with the clouds, turning them amber and gold in colors that belonged more to a painting than to a November sky in New Mexico territory. "Why?" she said. He took a breath and said the true thing. "Because I have not felt like this in a very long time, possibly ever, and I think you might feel something similar, and I would rather find out if that is true than spend the rest of my life wondering about it." Pauline stood in the doorway of the hotel room and looked at him with those gray eyes that saw everything clearly, and he stood in the corridor holding his hat again, which was apparently what he did when he was at the outer limit of his composure. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. I will make tea if this hotel's kitchen has cooperated tonight." The hotel's kitchen had cooperated. They sat with cups of weak tea on either side of a small table by the window, and the extraordinary sky finished its performance behind them. And she told him that she was not, in point of fact, someone who had a great deal of experience with allowing her feelings to direct her decisions, that her experience of doing so had gone badly the one time she had tried it, and that she found the prospect of trying again more alarming than she found most alarming things, which, given her personal history, included government investigations, a difficult marriage, and being asked to decode a criminal cipher at midnight, so the bar for alarming was not trivial. "I know," he said. "I also," she said more quietly, "cannot imagine getting back on that stage on Friday and going to Albuquerque and having the rest of my life proceed as though I had not met you." The room was very quiet. Outside, the last light left the sky. Raymond reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, and she looked down at his hand and then up at his face, and he thought that whatever happened next, he was going to be honest with her in all the ways that mattered, because she was the kind of person who would know immediately if he wasn't, and because she deserved it besides. "What would it take," he said, "for you to stay in Redemption Creek?" She thought about this in the careful way she thought about everything, and then she said, "Work." He blinked. "Work. I am not," she said with precision, "a woman who can sit in a parlor indefinitely. If I am going to live somewhere, I need something to do that uses my abilities. I need a problem." She paused. "I spent 3 years in Washington doing work that was genuinely important and I was good at it, and then I spent 2 years not doing it, and the not doing it was substantially worse than anything else about my marriage." She met his eyes. "If there is something here that needs the specific things I can do, I would stay." Raymond looked at her and thought about the Holloway case documents still being worked through by the federal marshal's office. He thought about the fact that the territorial government had no cryptographic capability at all, that the nearest person with Pauline's skills was in Washington. He thought about the fact that Marcus Pryor from the Nevada Silver Mining Company had asked him specifically, in the letter he had sent following the case's resolution, whether the woman who had decoded the cipher was available for consultation on an ongoing basis. He thought about the fact that the county board, who had been enormously impressed by the resolution of the Holloway situation, would probably give him most of what he asked for at the next budget meeting. "I think," he said slowly, "that the county of Doña Ana might be persuaded to fund a position, something like a civilian consulting analyst for the sheriff's office." He watched her face. "Given that the county almost lost $70,000 in payroll and a significant number of lives to a situation that one correctly applied analyst resolved in 15 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. "That is a creative interpretation of county resources. I am a creative man." Something that was definitely a smile crossed her face, the full version, the one he had been catching glimpses of for 6 weeks, and it was, he found, even better than he had anticipated. She did not get on the stage on Friday. December in Redemption Creek was cold and bright, the mountains holding snow above the town and the desert floor hard with frost in the mornings. Pauline established herself in a small office adjacent to the jailhouse that had previously been used for storage, and she transformed it with frightening efficiency into something that looked like a functional workspace. Bookshelves assembled from timber, a proper writing desk, a shelf of reference materials that she had ordered from a bookseller in Albuquerque, and which arrived by freight in early December. She was officially retained as a consulting analytical specialist for the Doña Ana County Sheriff's Office at a salary of $40 a month, which the county board approved at their December meeting with less argument than Raymond had expected, primarily because Marcus Pryor from the Nevada Silver Mining Company had sent the board a letter that was generous in its praise and specific in its financial implications. The board was practical men. $40 a month for the person who had saved $70,000 in payroll was clearly reasonable. Raymond moved through these December weeks in a state of sustained internal warmth that was quite distinct from anything in his previous experience. He saw Pauline every day, which was both logistically inevitable and personally significant, and they had fallen into the easy rhythms of two people who are becoming genuinely known to each other. The small habits and preferences and conversational patterns that accumulate into intimacy, without any single moment of their establishment being remarkable. She always made the morning coffee too strong and offered no apologies for this. He found this entirely acceptable and told her so. She was at her best in the mornings when her mind was sharp and the day's problems were fresh. She was slower to start conversation in the evenings and preferred quiet, which suited him because he was a man who had made peace with silence long ago. She read in the evenings, actual books from the new shelf, with a focus that made conversation inadvisable, and he had taken to reading across from her with a lamp between them in the warm little office, and the specific quality of comfortable silence that surrounded those evenings was something he had not had in his adult life and had not known he wanted. She told him more about the Treasury work as they went, the specific cases she had worked, the methods she had developed for pattern analysis, the way that criminal financial systems tended to replicate certain structural features regardless of the specific crime involved. He listened and asked questions, real questions, the kind that demonstrated he was following and thinking rather than simply performing interest, and she responded to his questions with increasing openness, like a door that has been stuck swinging free on its hinges. She asked him once in a late December evening with the lamp between them and snow on the ground outside whether he had ever thought about leaving law enforcement. He thought about it honestly. When Eddie died, he said, yes, for about a month, but the alternative is something I cannot quite picture. It is who I am. I understand that, she said. Work that is who you are, she paused. It is not something everyone experiences. You have it with the analysis work, he said. Yes, she said. I lost it for 2 years and I did not fully understand what I had lost until I was doing it again. In your jailhouse, at midnight, with a criminal cipher, he smiled. Romantic circumstances. Extremely, she agreed, and the word was dry but her eyes were warm, and he looked at her across the lamplight and thought that he was not going to be able to wait very much longer to say the other things that needed saying. He said them on Christmas Day, which arrived with cold, clear sky and a stillness over Redemption Creek that felt like the town was holding its breath. There was a small celebration at the church, which served most of the town's social functions for lack of other facilities, and afterward Raymond walked Pauline back to her hotel through streets that were empty and quiet, the mountains huge and white-topped against the blue sky. He stopped on the street in front of the hotel. She turned to look at him, and the winter light on her face was unfair in the specific way that winter light in the high desert is unfair to everyone, because it shows things with complete clarity, no softening. And what it showed was a woman who was 30 and absolutely certain of herself and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with decorative intent. I love you, Raymond said. That is not a position I have arrived at quickly or without consideration. But it is true, and I wanted to say it clearly. Pauline Hart looked at him in the winter light of Christmas Day, 1883, in the main street of Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, and she was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was being genuinely careful. "I know," she said. "I have known for several weeks. I was waiting for you to say it." He laughed, which was not what he had expected from himself at this particular moment, and she smiled the full smile, and he stepped toward her and she did not step back, and he kissed her in the empty street with the mountains behind them and the cold, clear air around them, and it was, by any measure, the best decision he had made in a very long time. The spring of 1884 came to Redemption Creek with a particular sweetness that might have been objective, or might have been the specific sweetness of a man in love who has stopped trying to manage the feeling. The snows melted in the sand and drays, and the creek beds ran with meltwater, and the desert floor greened up with a brief, extravagant generosity before the summer heat arrived. Raymond and Pauline were formally courting in the way that Redemption Creek understood formal courtship, which was to say that everyone in town already knew everything about their relationship's progress and expressed opinions on it with the comfortable intimacy of a small community, and Pauline found this simultaneously amusing and occasionally maddening. "Mrs. Fletcher at the dry goods store asked me today when we planned to set a date," she told Raymond one evening in March. "I told her we had not had that particular conversation. She looked at me as though I had admitted to some failure of basic functioning." Raymond, who was doing the paperwork his position generated in constant and discouraging quantities, set down his pen and looked at her with an expression she was learning to read as his thinking face, the look he had when he was actually dealing with something rather than just processing it. "Would you like to have that conversation?" he said. She looked at him. "Are you asking me because Mrs. Fletcher made you feel the pressure of community expectation, or are you asking me because you want to?" "The latter," he said. "Entirely the latter. Mrs. Fletcher's opinions have no measurable influence on my personal decisions." Pauline was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he could hear the wind along the main street and the distant sound of the saloon next door and all the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in Redemption Creek, the town that had become, without any deliberate intention on her part, the place where she lived. "Yes," she said, "I would like to have that conversation." They were married in June of 1884 in the Redemption Creek Church, in a ceremony that was attended by what seemed like the entire population of the town and its surrounding territory, because Raymond Hadley was known to everyone and Pauline Hart, in 8 months, had become known to most of them, and people in small towns feel strongly about the romantic conclusions of their neighbors' stories. George Whitmore stood beside Raymond with the expression of a man who has been right about something for a long time and is experiencing the particular pleasure of that vindication. The Vasquez family, who had purchased the Hart land claim and were making genuinely good use of it, sat in the third row. Marcus Pryor sent a letter of congratulations from Nevada that arrived 2 days after the wedding and that Pauline read with quiet amusement. The ceremony was performed by a minister who had come down from Socorro for the occasion, and who was somewhat surprised to be asked by the bride whether the ceremony could proceed without the word obey in the relevant passage, because she had looked at the liturgy in advance and found the specific wording inconsistent with her view of the institution. The minister, who had been warned by Raymond that Mrs. Hart was a particular kind of person, agreed to the modification without significant resistance. Raymond said his vows looking directly at her face and meaning every word with the absolute specificity of a man who has thought about what words mean before using them. Pauline said hers with the same directness, unhesitating and clear, and the minister said afterward that in 20 years of performing marriages, he had rarely had the sense so strongly that two people understood precisely what they were promising. The summer of 1884 was a good summer for the territory and a good summer for them. Pauline continued her work for the county, which had evolved beyond the original consultation arrangement into something more substantive. The Holloway prosecution had generated federal interest in the documents she had analyzed, and she had been asked to assist with 2 additional cases, one involving counterfeit land grant documents and one involving a network of freight fraud that had been operating across 3 territories. She worked on these cases with the focused pleasure of someone doing work they love, and Raymond watched her at her desk in the little office beside the jailhouse and felt an uncomplicated pride that had no trace of competition in it. This was, she told him once, the thing that surprised her most. In Washington, she said, the men I worked with were always managing their relationship with my competence, finding ways to minimize it or take credit for it or express discomfort with it. You are not like that. Why would I be? He said, genuinely puzzled. She looked at him. It surprises more people than you apparently realize. Then they are foolish people, Raymond said. You are the best analytical mind I have ever encountered. That is an asset. It solves problems. Why would I be anything but glad? She was quiet for a moment, and he recognized the expression she had when she was letting something matter to her instead of keeping it at arm's length. That is a generous thing to say. It is an accurate thing to say, he corrected. I try to avoid generosity that outpaces accuracy. It is not useful. She crossed the room and kissed him with a decisiveness that knocked his coffee nearly off the desk, and he caught the cup and laughed, and she laughed too, and the office with its 2 strong coffee and its organized bookshelves and its window looking out over the main street of Redemption Creek felt like exactly the right place to be. In September of 1884, the federal case connected to the Holloway prosecution came fully to trial in Santa Fe. Pauline was asked to testify regarding her decoding of the original cipher, which she did with the measured precision that characterized her best work. And the prosecuting attorney later told Raymond that she had been the most effective technical witness he had encountered in 12 years of practice, because she explained complex material with clarity and answered hostile cross-examination without becoming either defensive or vague. Crane Holloway was convicted on 12 counts and sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary. The inside man from the mining company received 6 years. 4 of the compromised county officials resigned under pressure of the evidence, and 1 was prosecuted. Dolph Sears, who had cooperated substantially with federal investigators, received a lighter sentence than his guilt warranted and relocated to Arizona Territory upon his release, which Raymond considered adequate justice given the circumstances. The verdicts were delivered on a warm September Thursday, and Raymond and Pauline sat in the gallery of the Santa Fe courtroom and heard them read. And when the last count was delivered and the gavel came down, Raymond looked at Pauline and saw on her face something he recognized as the clean satisfaction of a completed task. One that had begun on a midnight in October a year ago when she had sat down at a desk in a New Mexico jailhouse and decoded a message that nobody else in the territory could read. Done, he said. Done, she agreed, and leaned her shoulder against his, a small and undemonstrative gesture that in the context of who Pauline Hart was meant approximately as much as a full embrace from anyone else. They rode back to Redemption Creek on the Saturday stage, and the San Andres was golden in the autumn light, and the town looked, as it always did, like a rumor of civilization crouching in the desert, and Raymond thought that he had never been so glad to be going home. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was quiet, which in Raymond's experience meant it was either genuinely quiet or something was gathering itself that he had not identified yet. He chose to believe the former, because he was a man who had learned the particular discipline of not inventing problems in the absence of evidence, and because he had more than enough to occupy himself with the ordinary business of the county, which included a prolonged dispute between 2 neighboring ranchers over a fence line that threatened to become violent, a problem with unlicensed whiskey trading in the southern part of the county that required careful management, and the ongoing maintenance of the small organization he had built in the sheriff's office, which now included George Whitmore as senior deputy and two newer men who required training and supervision. In March of 1885, Pauline told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the practical way she told him most things, in the morning over coffee, directly and without elaborate preamble. He set down his cup and looked at her face, and then he stood up and crossed the kitchen of the small house they had moved into in September, the house on the east edge of town, with the long windows and the view of the mountains, and he put his arms around her and held her for a long time without saying anything at all. She allowed this. She was not by nature a woman who stood still for extended embraces, being too energetic for sustained stillness, but she allowed this particular one, and he felt her relax against him in the way she only did in private, the specific letting go of the composure she wore in public. "How are you feeling?" he asked finally. "Well," she said, and already thinking about how to organize the work schedule around the likely timeline, because the Albuquerque fraud case has a filing deadline in August and I need to account for variability in. She stopped because he was laughing quietly against her hair. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Only you." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It is the opposite of a complaint. It is the most accurate description I could give of why I love you." Their son was born in October of 1885, in the same month as everything significant in Raymond's life had chosen to announce itself. He was a healthy and demanding child who arrived somewhat ahead of schedule, and who made his opinions about the transition from womb to world known with remarkable volume and energy. Raymond was present for the birth, which was managed by the town's doctor and by Maria Vasquez from the land claim family, who had 3 children of her own and a steadiness about the process that was enormously helpful. Pauline labored with the same focused determination she brought to difficult problems, and Raymond held her hand through the worst of it and said little except what was needed, because he understood by this point that unnecessary words were not her preference, and that his presence and his steadiness were the things that actually helped. When the baby was placed in her arms and she looked down at him with an expression Raymond had never seen on her face before, something beyond composed and beyond analytical, a raw and unguarded wonder that she made no attempt to manage. He thought that he was witnessing the same opening he had seen on that October morning in the desert when she had made the coffee, and come outside to find him looking at the mountains, the moment when she stopped performing competence and simply was. They named him Thomas because that was Pauline's choice, and she made it without ambivalence, not as a tribute to the man who had been her first husband, but as a reclamation, a taking back of a name from the context it had been given in, and the placing of it in a better one. Raymond accepted this without comment because he understood what she was doing and thought it was the right decision. Thomas Hadley was a curious and active child who showed signs in his first 2 years of having inherited something from both of his parents. His mother's tendency to look at things with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging them, and his father's physical confidence in the world around him. He was also extremely social in a way that neither parent entirely was, and regularly attempted to charm everyone who came into view, a quality that George Whitmore found hilarious, and that Raymond watched with a mixture of amusement, and something he eventually identified as profound fondness. Pauline continued her consulting work throughout 1886 with the adjustments that parenthood required, and she managed these adjustments with the efficiency that characterized everything she did, organizing her time around Thomas's schedule and the baby's rhythms with the same systematic thinking she applied to Cipher analysis. She was not a woman who found domesticity fulfilling in itself, and she did not pretend to, but she was a woman who loved her son with a completeness that surprised her in its depth, and she was a woman who had constructed a life that contained both the work that fed her mind and the people who fed her heart, and she understood, in the measured way she understood most important things, that this was not something everyone managed. In the spring of 1887, a letter arrived from the Treasury Department in Washington. They had been tracking Pauline's consulting work with the territorial authorities. The Holloway case documents had made their way through enough federal channels to attract attention, and the letter was from a senior official in the office of the Chief of the Secret Service asking whether she would consider a formal appointment as a regional cryptographic specialist, a new position being created in response to the growing sophistication of criminal financial operations in the Western Territories. She brought the letter to Raymond that evening and put it on the table between them. He read it carefully. Then he read it again. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at the letter. "Position is regional. It would be based in Albuquerque, not Washington. It involves travel to various territorial jurisdictions, but the home base would be within the territory." She paused. "It is a significant appointment, significantly better than the county consulting arrangement in terms of scope and resources." "I know," Raymond said. "What do you want to do?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I want to accept it," she said. "If we can make it work with Thomas and with your position here." "We can make it work," Raymond said. "George can handle the county work for stretches. The position has a travel component, so I can ride circuit with you when it is safe to do so, and when it is not, Maria Vasquez has already told me 3 times that she would take Thomas for any length of time we needed." Pauline looked at him. "You are not troubled by this. Should I be? Some men," she said carefully, "would find it difficult. A wife with a federal appointment, a position with more institutional status than the county sheriff's role." Raymond leaned forward across the table and took her hand in both of his, which was the most direct gesture he had, a man who showed his feelings through action more than demonstration. "Pauline," he said, "I married the woman who decoded a criminal cipher in 15 minutes at midnight and saved $70,000 in payroll and 12 men's lives. I have never for a single day been confused about who you are. The idea that I would become confused about it because the federal government finally figured it out is not something you need to worry about." She was quiet for a moment, and something in her face shifted the way ice shifts in the spring, not breaking but beginning to release. Then she said, "You are a good man, Raymond Hadley." "I am a man," he said, "who had the considerable good fortune to stumble into your company in this particular town in this particular year, and who had enough sense to recognize it, which I admit took me a while." She smiled. 6 weeks. "I was cautious," he said. "You were extremely cautious," she agreed. He raised her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles, a gesture she had never quite gotten used to because it was so at odds with everything about his outward presentation. This large, rough-edged man with his rifle and his badge who kissed her knuckles like something out of a European novel she had read at the Ohio College of Liberal Arts, and it undid her every time, which she suspected he was aware of. She accepted the Treasury Department position in May of 1887. The years that followed were good years, and they were good years in the specific way that only comes from having built something that fits the actual shapes of the people inside it rather than the shapes other people expect. Pauline's regional work took her across the New Mexico territory and into Arizona and Colorado on cases involving increasingly sophisticated financial fraud and the occasional cipher analysis that called for her particular skills. She was building a reputation within the federal system that was based entirely on the work, on results, on the specific clarity of her analytical mind applied to complex problems. And she moved through that professional world with a directness that had learned, over the years, to be appropriately diplomatic without losing its essential quality. Raymond ran Doña Ana County with quiet competence and the reputation of a man who was honest and not inclined to be pushed around. He built up the sheriff's office into something that could function without him when he was needed elsewhere, which happened more often as Pauline's cases occasionally required additional law enforcement coordination. And in those moments, he was both her husband and her professional partner, two roles that he navigated with the practicality of a man who had long since made his peace with the unconventional shape of his happiness. Thomas Hadley, at 4 years old, was showing every sign of becoming either a tremendous asset or a significant problem for the world, depending on the direction his energy found. He had his mother's focus and his father's physical fearlessness, and the combination was, George Whitmore observed, somewhat alarming. He also had a warmth with people that neither parent quite possessed, and that came from some combined place that was purely his own. In the autumn of 1888, Pauline told Raymond there was another child coming, with the same practical morning directness as the first time, and he crossed the kitchen again and held her for a long time, and she let him. And outside the window the San Andres were beginning to show their first fall colors, gold and amber in the morning light. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1889, smaller than Thomas had been and quieter, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular quality of stillness. They named her Clara, which had been Raymond's mother's name and which Pauline chose as her own choice, freely and without any pressure, because it was a good name, and because she had heard Raymond speak of his mother with a gentleness that he did not often let into his voice, and she wanted to give that gentleness somewhere to rest. Thomas was 3.5 when Clara arrived, old enough to understand that something significant had happened, and to have opinions about it that he expressed at length and with considerable volume. His opinion, once he had investigated the new arrival thoroughly, was that she was satisfactory, and that he intended to be responsible for teaching her the most important things, a conclusion he reached unilaterally, and that Raymond and Pauline received with the careful parental composure of two people trying not to laugh in front of a child. The town of Redemption Creek grew slowly through the late 1880s and into the 1890s. The silver operations in the mountains had their inevitable rises and declines, but the agriculture along the creek beds, which the territorial surveyor had predicted would be viable, turned out to be genuinely productive, and Redemption Creek became less of a rumor and more of an actual place, with a proper school and a doctor's office and a general store that stocked goods from as far east as St. Louis and as far west as Los Angeles. Raymond watched this growth with the satisfaction of a man who has had a hand in making something safe enough to become real. The work of law enforcement in a frontier territory was not glamorous in the long middle of it, between the moments of high stakes and crisis. It was mostly patience and paperwork and the slow accumulation of presence, the understanding that safety is not a thing that happens once but a thing that is built day by day out of consistency and fair dealing, and the willingness to be the person who does not look away from problems. He was good at this. He had always been good at it. The difference now was that he came home to the house on the east side of town with its long windows and its view of the mountains, and Pauline was there with her notebooks and her too-strong coffee and her mind that never entirely stopped working, and the children were there in whatever state of creative complexity they had generated for themselves that day, and the ordinary weight of ordinary evenings was something he had come to love in a way that surprised him still. In 1891, a case came through Pauline's federal work that connected to Raymond's jurisdiction in a way that required them to work directly together for the first time since the original Holloway matter, and they navigated it with the ease of two people who have spent years learning to function well in the same space. The case involved a land grant fraud operation that had been running for 3 years across the Southern Territory, using falsified documents to claim title to land already occupied by both Anglo settlers and the Hispanic families who had held those lands under Spanish and Mexican grants before American annexation. It was a complicated case with layers of injustice built into it, not just the current fraud but the longer history of dispossession that the fraud was exploiting. Pauline worked the document analysis with her usual precision, but she was also, Raymond noticed, paying attention to the human dimensions of the case in a way that she had always done, but that had deepened over the years. The families who had lost land they had worked for generations. The specific cruelty of using legal mechanism as a weapon against people who did not have equal access to legal protection. She wrote a report for the federal office that included not just the technical fraud analysis, but a broader assessment of the systemic vulnerabilities that made this kind of exploitation possible. And she was direct in it about the injustices being perpetrated against families who had legitimate historical claims. The report made some people in the federal office uncomfortable, because it named things clearly that the political environment preferred to leave unnamed. But it also, ultimately, contributed to a legal framework for addressing land grant claims that the territorial government adopted in 1892, and that protected some portion of those historical rights going forward. Raymond read the report and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the particular quality of Pauline's intelligence was that it did not stop at the boundary of what was immediately useful. She kept going until she reached the truth of something, and then she said the truth plainly. And over the years he had watched this quality of hers make both enemies and the kind of lasting good that enemies are generally unable to undo. In 1893, Thomas Hadley at age 7 announced with great confidence that he intended to become a marshal, which Raymond received with measured parental pride, and Clara at 4 announced with equal confidence that she intended to be a teacher, which Pauline received with quiet satisfaction. Neither parent told the children that plans made at age 4 and 7 were subject to revision. It was a warm evening in the summer of 1893 when Raymond and Pauline sat on the front step of the house on the east side of town, in the long late light of a New Mexico July, with the children inside eating supper with Maria Vasquez, who had become close to the family over the years, and the mountains turning their end-of-day colors that never quite became ordinary no matter how many times you saw them. Pauline had a notebook on her knee because she always had a notebook, but she was not writing in it. She was watching the light move on the San Andres. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me." "I was thinking about that evening in October of 1883, she said. "The first one, when George Whitmore came to the hotel to get me." She paused. "I had been in Redemption Creek for 5 weeks and I was already planning to leave. I had the stage booked. I was going to go to Albuquerque, and from there I was not sure, back east perhaps or somewhere else entirely. I was very finished with New Mexico territory. And," he said, "and George Whitmore knocked on my door and said there was a cipher nobody could read, and instead of telling him to find someone else, I got up and put my shawl on and went to the jailhouse." She was quiet for a moment. "I did not go because of you. I had barely registered you at that point. I went because a cipher nobody could read is exactly the kind of problem I cannot say no to. The specific shape of it was irresistible to me." "And then," he said. She looked at him, and in the long evening light of a New Mexico summer her face was the face he knew better than any other, every plane and shadow of it, the particular line of her mouth when she was working up to saying something that mattered, the quality of her eyes when they were fully present with him rather than half somewhere else in a problem. "And then," she said, "I sat down across from a sheriff who was big enough to fill the whole room and who looked like he had ridden in from something hard, and I decoded the cipher. And when I was done he looked at me like—" She stopped, and something shifted in her expression, something rare and soft, like I was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. Not threatening, not unsettling, just extraordinary. She looked out at the mountains for a moment. "I had not been looked at that way very often." Raymond was quiet. "I told myself on the way back to the hotel," she continued, "that it was irrelevant. That I was leaving in the morning and that a sheriff who looked at me correctly was not sufficient reason to alter plans that were based on more substantial foundations." She glanced at him. "I was wrong about that." He took her hand. "You stayed," he said. "You asked me to," she said. "But that was not why I stayed." She laced her fingers through his. "I stayed because when you asked me to stay, you did not ask me to be less than I was. You did not ask me to be quieter or smaller or more convenient. You asked me to stay and bring everything I was with me." She paused. I had not been asked that before. The evening light on the San Andres was doing what it always did at this hour, turning the rock faces gold and amber and the shadows in the canyons deep blue, and the sky above them was moving toward the extraordinary colors that the desert sky produces in the hour before dark, colors that should be impossible but simply are every evening without ceremony. "I love you," Raymond said, which was not new information and had never required extensive context, but which was true every time he said it with the specific weight of everything he meant by it. "I know," she said, which was what she always said, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the long evening light while the mountains did their ancient and unconcerned thing. And inside the house, Thomas was telling Maria Vasquez something about marshals, and Clara was, from the sound of it, offering corrections to whatever Thomas was saying. And it was, by any measure, an entirely and completely good life. The redemption creek that Raymond and Pauline Hadley inhabited in the years that followed continued to change, as all things change, with the particular pace of a frontier town being slowly absorbed into a more ordered world as the century moved toward its end. The railroad came through the Southern Territory, which changed the economics of everything and brought new people and new complications, and the general irreversible alteration of a landscape that arrives with iron rails and regular schedules. Raymond served as sheriff of Doña Ana County until 1897, when he was 50 years old, and had been at the work for 17 years in the same county. He was offered the county judge position, which came open that year, and he took it after extended conversation with Pauline about what the transition would mean, a conversation that took 3 evenings and covered ground he had not expected, including his own uncertainty about whether his capabilities translated to the judicial role, and his worry about whether stepping back from active law enforcement would leave him without the purpose he had built his life around. Pauline listened to all of it with complete attention and then said, with the precision that 10 years of marriage had not diminished, "The quality you have always had as a sheriff is that you understand what justice is supposed to do, not just what the law says, what the law is for. That is not a sheriff's quality. That is a judge's quality, and it is rarer than either law enforcement or the legal profession would like to admit." He became a judge. He was a good one, for the reasons she identified, and for the additional reason that he brought to the bench the same quality of direct honesty that had characterized everything else he had done, the refusal to look away from things that were inconvenient to see. Pauline continued her federal consulting work through the end of the century and into the early years of the new one, evolving as the field evolved, as the techniques and technologies of both criminal operation and law enforcement became more sophisticated. She was still the sharpest analytical mind in the regional network, and she was sought after for the most complex cases, and she went on doing the work with the focused pleasure of someone who never stopped finding it genuinely interesting. Thomas Hadley grew up straight and capable, and ultimately did not become a marshal, becoming instead a surveyor, which turned out to be a profession that suited his particular combination of his mother's precision and his father's comfort with difficult terrain. He worked across the Southwest and eventually settled in Arizona Territory with a woman from a Navajo family named Elena, whose own people had their own long and complicated history with the land that Thomas surveyed, and who brought to their marriage a knowledge of the territory that Thomas spent years learning to properly respect. They had 2 sons, and Raymond and Pauline drove to Arizona to meet the first of those grandchildren on a warm spring morning in 1908, and Raymond held that infant and looked at him, and thought that the world is very large and very full, and that the accumulation of a life lived with intention and honesty, eventually produces things that are simply and entirely good. Clara Hadley did become a teacher, as she had announced at age 4, which was either prescience or the kind of stubborn consistency that occasionally produces the same result. She taught at the Redemption Creek School beginning in 1905, and was, by all accounts, formidable in the best sense, demanding and fair and consistently underestimated by anyone who encountered her slight figure and quiet manner before they spent time in her classroom. She had her mother's exactness and her father's patience and neither tendency toward underestimating the people in her charge. In 1910, Raymond and Pauline Hadley had been married for 26 years, and Redemption Creek was a proper town now, with a courthouse and a telegraph office and a public library, the library being a project that Pauline had pushed for in 1905 and ultimately funded in significant part from her own savings, because she believed firmly that a community without access to books was a community with a systemic problem that would eventually become everyone's problem. They were still in the house on the east side of town, with the long windows and the view of the mountains. The view had not changed. The mountains were doing what mountains do, which is outlast everything, including all the reasons that human beings give themselves for being impatient with the pace of things. Pauline's hair was silver now, a clean and decided silver that she wore with the same absence of apology she had always brought to her own person, and it suited her in the way that honesty suits people who have always had it. Raymond's was mostly silver too, and the years had settled into his face, as years settle into the faces of people who have spent them outdoors and in sustained engagement with difficulty, leaving not damage but something more like character written in the skin. They were sitting in the evening on the front step of their house in the summer of 1910, the same front step where they had sat 17 years before, and the San Andres were doing their evening performance with the light, and it was still not ordinary, and it was still not something either of them took for granted. "I have been thinking," Pauline said, which was her standard opening for a conversation that was going to go somewhere interesting. "I know," Raymond said. "You always have a particular look." "I do not have a particular look." "You do," he said. "You have had it for 26 years, and I know it very well." She looked at him with an expression that was simultaneously exasperated and fond, which was a combination she had developed specifically for the experience of being married to this man. "I have been thinking about the cipher," she said. He waited. "The first one," she clarified. "The Wigner cipher. I have been thinking that the most significant thing about that night was not what I decoded. It was that Dolph Sears chose a Wigner cipher, which is a sophisticated system, and used it badly. The key word was his wife's name. The whole elaborate system collapsed because of a trivially human error." She paused. "I think about that often. The gap between the complexity of the structure and the simplicity of the failure." He thought about this. "What does it mean to you?" "I think," she said slowly, "it means that what defeats people is almost never the complicated thing they have prepared for. It is always the simple thing they have not thought to protect." She looked at the mountains. Thomas Hart was killed by the gap between what he thought he was doing and what he was actually doing. He thought he was protecting himself, and he was actually leaving a map to everything that could destroy the man he was working for. She paused. Crane Holloway thought his cipher system was impenetrable, and it was not impenetrable, it was just unfamiliar, which is not the same thing. "And us?" Raymond said. "What is our equivalent?" She looked at him for a long moment, the gray eyes that had been looking at him clearly for 26 years and finding him, as far as he could tell, adequately worth the attention. "I think our equivalent," she said, "is the things we said plainly, in this town, to each other." She paused. "That is what I would most not want to have gotten wrong." He put his arm around her, which he had done on this step before many times, and she leaned into his shoulder the way she had done on every one of those times, with the ease of long practice and the particular quality of presence that remains for two people who have actually stayed, who have been through the years and the difficulty and the ordinary accumulated weight of a life, and found each other still there, still necessary, still genuinely interesting. The mountains went gold and amber in the evening light. The San Andres had been there before Raymond and Pauline Hadley, and they would be there long after, doing the silent and magnificent thing that mountains do, which is stand as evidence that some things are large enough to hold everything human beings do in their shadow without being diminished by it. But in that house, on that step in that town, two people who had met at midnight over an impossible cipher in the autumn of 1883 were sitting together in the summer of 1910, with their whole lives behind them and whatever time remained ahead, and the world that contained them was, in the ways that mattered, exactly right. That was how it ended, and how it was, and how it remained.